Let's call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting of the Board of Trustees to discuss the overcrowding for Dearborn High School. And could we have a call to order, please?
Hussein Berry here. Fadwa Hamoud.
Here.
Mary Lane is on her way here. Celia Nesser.
Here.
Mary Petrikoff.
Here.
James Thorpe.
Here.
President Meade.
Here. Next item, please.
Action item. Special consideration of an action item. Are there any agenda items on this agenda which board members or the superintendent wish to discuss and vote on separately? Let me just skip through and just mention that we only have one item and it does require a roll call vote, so.
Correct.
Okay, so why don't we just go to, skipping down to recommended action. Move that an executive session close be held Monday, March 12, 2018 at 6 p.m. at the Administrative Service Center in the Superintendent's Conference Room to discuss negotiations per Section 8-C of the Michigan's Open Meetings Act.
So moved. Support.
I don't think there's any discussion. We don't have a choice, do we?
Any discussion?
No. Roll call vote. Hussein Berry, yes. Fadwa Hamoud.
Yes.
Mary, Celia Nesser.
Yes.
Mary Petrikoff.
Yes.
James Thorpe.
Yes.
President Meade.
Yes. Next item, please.
We're going into discussion. Item number 1, high school capacity. Dr. Glenn Maleko.
So I'll just kind of give an overview, thank you, Trustee Berry, of tonight, which we've been planning for a while. We've had, as everyone is aware, this issue has been on the board agenda since May of 2017. We've had, this will be actually the third study session. We have had 2 now that are dedicated just to this issue. One that was shared when it was initially introduced in May of 2017. And then we've had presentations, discussion items that have gone on at every single board meeting since then. I know we're going to have in the presentation a review of the timeline, so I just wanted to give an overview. Basically what we're going to see is a lot of presentations of information, a lot of data that we've been providing to the board. The board has received a tremendous amount of data going back to that time. My team has really spent a lot of time, a lot of hours on coming up with possible solutions to the high school capacity. I do want to stress that, there's not a perfect solution. There's a lot of solutions that the administration likes that we're recommending. But at this point, there's no perfect solution. And again, it is something that, for me, is we have to protect the long-term stability of the district and our students, and that's why we're acting now. That's why the board has taken on this issue. That's why I've recommended that we address it. These are tough decisions, but that's why we're here, to make those tough choices to protect the interests of the school district and, of course, the students in the community. So what you're going to see is information. We have my team that's here. We have the executive directors. We have all the high school principals here. We've had several meetings with not only the team, but we've invited the high school principals for their input. We also have representatives from TMP and Clark Construction that are here today that are going to provide a lot of data based on their expertise. You're going to see a presentation by Mr. Wall as well, who's going to talk about current infrastructure and the buildings and the age of a lot of our beautiful buildings, but they're getting old, and so we have to make those considerations as well. So, having said that, if there's no other questions or comments by the board, I'm going to get started with the first presentation.
I would just like to thank everybody for all their input, citizens as well as the administrative staff. Everybody that has contributed to this. It's been a long session. We've been going at this for a long time. And all the input has been just critical, and we appreciate that you're willing to do it again, take us through the process again, and help us to see what are some possibilities. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to start with an overview of timeline and history. We'll start with Mesa Malibazi, Tom Wall, and David Mustin, and you'll see that right now we're not in a formal presentation mode, conversational. We're sitting at tables as we normally do during a study session, and that's kind of how we're going to conduct the entire. You may see some individuals shifting around at the main chairs because you have to work the PowerPoint, but that's how we'll operate this meeting over the course of the next 4 hours.
It's good to move around.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, President Meade, trustees. Superintendent Maleko. Yeah, we will be playing a little musical chairs here, but it works better for the technology as well. So just kind of starting off once again with a timeline, just to kind of put in perspective where this all started way back in May is when the discussions began at the board meeting. You did have a study session in August, similar to a study session like this, where a lot of information was shared, especially enrollment data. 3 separate companies came in and presented what their projections were as well as our projections. Then we continued with some presentations at the board meetings. And then, of course, we held our community forums at the direction of the Board of Education. Mr. Jafer and I were out and about in the district in October and November at 10 different community forums. Then we brought that information back to the board in December for some additional processing. And then in January, we shared with you the results of those community forums and kind of the feedback that came out of those forums. And then in February, based upon that feedback, a couple other proposals were shared with the Board of Education, adjusting the proposals that were shared way back in the fall. And then last month, you got a preview of tonight's presentation. And tonight's presentation is what you saw in February with a little bit more tweaking done, again, to adjust for feedback that we've been receiving. And then looking forward, we hope that there'll be some type of resolution and some type of direction given at the next board meeting in March. And then also looking ahead at possible solutions, looking at a much broader picture, not just boundaries, but the infrastructure in our district. We have, as Mr. Wall will present here in a little bit, some information, some financial information, and some information on the history of our buildings. From the years 2020 to 2030 will be an interesting time in our district. Plan on a lot of celebrations. Get your party hat on, because during that time we'll have 13 different buildings will celebrate their 100th anniversary from 2020 to 2030. So there'll be a lot of fun and partying going on during that decade, and who knows? Hopefully I'll be around for some of that. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Wall, and he can talk about some of the financial aspects.
Good evening. Some of the information I'm going to provide is just generic information. As we go through the presentation, it'll get more formalized. One of the questions came up is our tax base. We have roughly about a $3.3 billion tax base. And when you talk about millages and how much it would raise or actually cost to do things for us, because Proposal A does not fund, capital improvements. Proposal A is just for operating procedures. So anything we do with capital is above and beyond what the state gives us for money. Now, we can take it out of our money, but most districts can't afford to do that on an operational basis, and therefore we actually have to go to the public or do some non-voter approved bonds to actually fund the capital we need to do large improvements. Now, we do transfer some of our own operation money to our building and site fund to do projects, but again, that's a very small amount compared to the need. So when we look at the slide here of a $3.3 billion tax base is built on our taxable values, and for every $1,000 in tax base, we get to raise $1. So if you look at a 1 mil cost on a tax base of $3.3 billion, you're talking $3.3 million is what we can raise on an annual basis. Go to the next slide. So if that was an easy calculation, that'd be great. So we know how much money we need, what our tax base is. We can just figure out an easy calculation. It's not that simple, because obviously there's a lot of things that go into construction. Now, it's not something you can build right away. So the longer the project takes to build, you have the cost of inflation that's going to go on the cost of those services and supplies. So the longer the project, the longer it's going to cost in the long term. Also, things aren't as simple. You have to obviously build your foundation before you do the roof. So that's going to extend the time. So those kind of things go into it, makes it more complicated. So when you look at construction numbers, it's not necessarily what the cost is today, but what it will be further down the line in a couple of years. Now, outside of new construction, well, no, let me go back. So one of the questions that came up from the public was, how much mills would we have to levy if we want to do a high school and we want to put it on the ballot. I worked with our financial planners from PFM. They say roughly about 2 mills will raise about $117 million as a general idea. Now, it'd actually be 1 point something, but I just rounded to 2 mills to kind of give you an idea. And when we get the later presentation from Clark and TMP, they'll get the more specifics of what size high school and the cost. They'll take that conversation further. So on the value of a house, so if you have a $75,000 house, again, dividing it by 1,000, you look at roughly $75 annually for 2 mills.
So I had a
Yes.
couple of questions for you from this slide. So at the top, you're saying 2 mills would get us 117 million.
Correct.
At the bottom, it says then house value of 75,000 is 75 annually. It would really be 150 then at 2 mills.
Well, you gotta divide it by 1,000. Oh, wait, you are correct.
That's right.
The second thing is
Well,
when you're
no.
putting these,
Well, no, because the
I was going to say, are you talking state equalized value when you're talking about the value of these homes?
You're talking about taxable
So a person
values.
understands that the taxable value of a $75,000 home is really about a $150,000 home that you're buying.
Right, right. So that's half to begin with, correct.
Not-
So yes, so my math is off slightly because I already halved it when I looked at the mills.
The other question, and I know you're probably about to get to this, 2% growth rate taxable value, is that based historically on what we've been averaging since we came out of the recession?
Yes, our 5-year average for the last 5 years has roughly been 2% increase.
And with interest rates moving higher, are you still feeling confident that we could get bonds at 5%?
Yeah, right now the interest rate is a little over 4%.
Okay.
So in a couple of years, we figure the natural increase of where the federal government is raising rates or projecting to raise rates, that 5% would be the average we would be at.
Okay, thanks.
So obviously with the new capital improvements, we also have to worry about our existing. In your board folder, there was a several-page report about current capital needs. Tim Grzinski, our operations director for trades and programs, sat down with the principals, went through that program, and looked at what's out there and what the principals would like to have seen improve at their building, along with what he does, looking at roofs, boilers, all those things that's the infrastructure side. When we looked at it across the entire district over the next 3 to 10 years, that number on that spreadsheet came to about $162 million total.
For over 10 years?
For the next 3 to 10 years, what we would have to look at for replacement.
All right, so is that a bond issue?
Well, we could never afford to obviously do
Can't take it out
$162
of the
million.
operating budget.
On that spreadsheet, you said that spreadsheet, it's a living document. So we started that spreadsheet 2 years ago when I came here to start looking at those kind of things. We've taken our current operating proceeds and knocked off roughly about $3 million over the last 2 years. Now, obviously, we cannot continue to do that for the 3 to 10 years. We're not going to raise enough capital to make all those improvements that are going to be needed. So obviously, we have to look at some other long-term infrastructure needs to address that situation.
So these are required because of our buildings were built in 1920.
Correct.
So it is time to do all of these enhancements.
Right, so
we
some of
have
our
that-
boilers.
We have that bill that we have to pay, and we're gonna have to go for a bond issue to do it.
To affect the significant numbers that we need, yes.
Okay.
Now, some of our boilers are 50 years old. 50 years is the typical life. Our engineers and our custodians do great care and take care of those things, along with our operational directors. They do a great job expanding that life, but at some point, you know, that return of investment of continuously putting in the cost and repair, because it gets larger and larger as the older it gets, there's that turning point where it's just better off and actually replace it versus continuing to repair and upkeep. Mr. Hudlin, you had a question?
But just before the superintendent.
Oh.
So if we were to build a new high school, we would have a cost of what?
Well, the actual construction cost.
Yeah.
Of roughly anywhere from 80 to 120 million. That'll come later, depending on the size and capabilities.
All right.
But you'll also have the operational cost on an annual basis to actually
Okay.
operate that school.
All right, but you also have the cost of refurbishing the buildings.
Correct.
So we're talking about like 300 million? What do you-
Well, that's all into the whole conversation that we're going to have. You know,
Okay.
obviously, it's a community discussion, not just the district.
All right. Sue?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to mention that Tim and Tom did a great job. This report, they saved us a lot of money, actually, because a lot of times they get in, districts will hire someone and contract that out. So that's just important to remember. And in 2 years ago, some of you were on the strategic plan committee, we addressed that issue. We said it is coming. We had a presentation on the age of our buildings, and there's a couple reasons for that. One being that during the tough economic times and budget cuts, a lot of the board trustees who were on the board at the time may remember when the building and site fund went down to $300,000 a year for a district our size. Now we've built that back up as we've gotten a little better in economic times. But those are things that, and I want to commend our engineers and the maintenance staff. As other districts were having issues with their older buildings, ours were kept up and maintained, and they're beautiful buildings. Having said that, as buildings age, things are going to break down and they need to be repaired, and that's the work that Mr. Wall has done over the last couple of years since the strategic plan, which we said we need to address this issue. And it is in the strategic plan.
And times change, you know, safety and security was not that great of a concern back when the buildings were built. So for us to actually implement some of the new safety and security that are recommending, our buildings aren't meant or ain't capable of putting those kind of things into place.
When I look at this number, Tom, I know that I see all these spreadsheets that we had went over, and I know that at some point you prioritized
Correct.
the needs of every individual school. For one of which, Lori, I remember we talking about the boilers and so on, and the help that some of those schools need. Now, you also stated that you took some input from the principals and what people would like to see done.
Correct.
When we're talking about the $162 million, does that also include, you know, something I'd like to see done, or does that include needs that the schools have to have in order to maintain themselves and survive?
Well, it helps the instructional program. Obviously, one of the things that have come up before is the middle school sound systems. Some of those are very old. Now, can they get by with it? Sure, but is it actually enhancing the program? No, because it's hard time hearing, you know, it's crackling, so it impacts the program, but it's not. It's something that every year that list is going to get reprioritized because some things are more important than others. If a boiler breaks, obviously that's going to take precedence. So it's not necessarily once. Some months maybe they have a playground, it's grandfathered in, but again, it's very old, and you know, as times change, new studies come out of how to exercise kids on those kind of activities during recess and all that in gym, that our old equipment doesn't necessarily apply. So there's things that they would want to have, but not necessarily necessary. But for a good instructional program, we have to continually upgrade and modify our facilities.
Additionally, something that stands out in my mind is like the food service elevator at Lori. It's not repairable. And a building that size with multiple floors needs a food service elevator to function. So that would be an example of something that, you know, doesn't necessarily impact instruction directly, but needs to be repaired because they're struggling each day to get the lunches done and provide what they need to students.
And this number could go up next year if we don't move on some stuff, because
Correct. We're going to continue to try to, address issues on it, but it's going to be a sliding curve up that eventually we're not going to be able to keep up with just our operation parts.
okay, thank you.
Your numbers are not that far off from what we saw. I know Trustee Lane was on the board then 4 or 5 years ago when we were told we needed $350 million. And we told former Superintendent Brian Whiston, go sharpen your pencil. And that's when we went out for the $174 million. But easy addition, 174 and 162, you got 336. So I'm sure this is something that school district this size continues to plan for. What do we need 3 years from now? What do we need 5 years now, 10 years? So some of this stuff, if times were better and we would have went out for a $350 million bond, would have been taken care of by now. But we knew there'll come a day when we needed to do this, just to kind of acknowledge
Right.
some of the numbers.
You see smaller districts that are only 2,000, 3,000 kids doing a $70 million bond issue.
Yeah.
We're obviously the third largest in Michigan. The number seems big, but for our size, it doesn't really impact the same as it would as
I think we were all in agreement back then, if we would have went out for the 350, that wouldn't have happened, so I'm glad we did the way we did, so these numbers are real.
Trustee Nasser?
So if this had to go, it would go on next year's,
Well, actually, the next slide, so if you don't mind me transition
yeah.
to the next slide. So the next slide talks about opportunity that's similar in 2014, coming up in 2019 with us doing the refunding and saving the community $3 million last year on our refunding of our existing debt. And in 2019, we'll see a natural decline in our millage rate as part of the paying off the debt on our payment schedule. that we'll have the same opportunity we had in 2014 of going back out to the voters, maintaining our current debt millage, and raising roughly about $175 million in bonding capability to actually address any additional construction or our existing needs, at no increase to the taxpayers on their current millage rate. Now, so when I looked at it, was roughly looking at November of 2019, so it'd be a general election, of looking at that timetable of addressing a potential bond issue. That, well, obviously, if we're going to do something at that time frame, it takes a good 12 to 18 months to go through that whole cycle process of getting community input, getting school input, and taking it to the state for review, and actually getting on the ballot. So it's not something that you can just wait until next year and actually address. There is a timetable you have to address to look at it. So I just want to bring that up to the discussion, that that's something that's available to us coming up here in a year and a half.
One thing can I mention too, with all this, you know, we have a district plan with the school safety issues that are coming up and some of the designs. That also impacts with the age of the buildings. We've done some changes from the last bond where we have more of the secured entrances where you go through one door through the office to get to the second, the same thing here. But not every building is equipped that way because of the design. So those might be other considerations if we want to move on some of those models in all schools. That could be part of that discussion with that community input and the committee looking at a bond.
And that security issue and those ideas are not included in the 162. Those are just repairs.
Correct.
We don't
Those
have a
would be
budget on
new
what
construction, correct.
we haven't studied a budget of what we would like to see in our schools in terms of better security. That's a whole nother issue.
Correct. So Trustee Nasser, did I address your question?
Yep.
Okay. So the next 3 slides is not something I'm really going to cover. It just gives the current date of our buildings, the date it was built, and all the additions that was put on over the last several decades. So I just want to make sure that's information you have in case you, just for backup information. All right, no more questions for me, then David can transition to the next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Mashur. I can push the button, sir. You can.
Push the buttons for me.
Can I just mention too, just to frame it, that, you know, our team, as I said, has been meeting. We spent several hours in what we call the Situation Room, our conference, over the course of the last year. Lots of time, a lot of studies, a lot of data, because that data is coming from our team and it's disseminated to the board. So what we're hoping to do tonight, which it's kind of outlined, is we'd like to, and that Mr. Mashur is going to be presenting on some of this, but we'd like to have, you know, a decision, as we mentioned, for some immediate population relief, most specifically for Dearborn High. We're looking at Fortson, but the issue really initiated because of Dearborn High, which has the more immediate needs based on the population. Fortson we're monitoring, and we also have had that on the issue to solve. So when we look at that, we're looking at some immediate relief. And then secondly, the reason we had Mr. Wall mention all this data is because if there's any other decisions made outside of a short-term relief, or, you know, initial population relief, it would go to that infrastructure. We'd like to look at a committee that will look at this infrastructure with looking at bonds and all factors in the district. And that's why we thought it'd be very important. Mr. Wall, Mr. Gruzinski, and Dr. Ball came to me and said, Glenn, we need to make sure, Dr. Malik, we need to make sure that this is not forgotten, and that's why we're putting it on the table, because it's important. And Mr. Burek would be in the same boat, always talking about the infrastructure. So I just wanted to frame that as Mr. Mashur moves on the potential options.
It would be nice to get the infrastructure committee and have our security team as well, maybe at some point work together to see how we could at some point try to find common ideas in terms of combining security, keeping security in mind when we're thinking about infrastructure in our schools.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody.
Trustee Lane.
If there's going to be a little broader review, perhaps also, I don't know, but when I looked at the background materials and I looked at 500 kids stout, 500 kids stout, 80 or 580, all of a sudden I started, and Woodworth too, I'm starting to wonder, do we have potentially looming an overcrowding at the middle schools, at least at 2 of them? I mean, Stout and Woodworth's numbers are high. I don't know, I haven't looked at them most recently, but
No, they are high.
that's,
Well, and quite frankly, then we would have to go down into the elementary then and see what's feeding up. I mean, this isn't a problem that just occurs
At the high school.
isolated. It's a problem that's in the growth of the entire school community. So we would have to really see how the numbers long-term were going to shake from elementary up to middle.
yeah, I don't want to distract from the high
Right.
school conversation right now, but we might get one done, and we may as well keep our eye further down the road if we have the middle school issue as well. So,
It's not an issue yet at the middle schools because
Okay.
we have the space for them right now.
okay, but,
So, yeah, if we
I
get
do
a-
remember
if we get a grade increase,
conversations
right.
about what's theoretical, like Stout is, Stout, they say can hold 900 kids. In reality, it can't hold 900 kids. That's just the total number of lockers.
Right.
The other consideration, which is coming out of some of the finance studies, is, and I've mentioned it before several times, we're big proponents of preschool and early childhood. So we definitely do not, we have some space at the elementaries for that, but we do not have a lot of room to expand that. So if we do get additional funding coming from the state, we have to consider that at the elementary grades or a Cotter-type facility. And Dr. Chokol, I know Ms. Lamberti and others, the principals have worked hard to try to fit some of the classes in the current infrastructure of the buildings. You might recall we had 2 that we got halfway through the year, and we made it work. So we're also doing an inventory of those rooms, so we know exactly. And I think Trustee Thorpe, you had mentioned that to me too, to be aware of, elementary and middle. So we'll definitely keep that on the radar.
Okay. All right. So currently, what do our boundaries look like? Where do our middle schools feed into? Dearborn High, you have all of Bryant pretty much. There's always a small percentage, even the ones that say all, like Bryant, Salina, and Lori. You're going to lose a few students for whatever reason. Some of them go to private schools. Some of them go to our specialized school or specialized high school or what have you. The early college, for example, early college of manufacturing, that type of thing. So anyhow, but pretty much all of Bryant goes to Dearborn High. A small portion of Smith, the River Oaks students who go from River Oaks Smith, then they come back to Dearborn High. Eunice students, we have a small group of students from Eunice that go to Dearborn High. And then the Stout, the Maple students that attended Stout also go to Dearborn High. Etzel Ford has Salina, a large portion of Smith, the majority of students from Smith. And then Stout has, also feeds in, the Snowwoods area feeds into Etzel Ford. Fordson, pretty much all of Lori, most of Woodworth. There's some students from Woodworth that do go to Etzel Ford's, the ones that are south of Michigan Avenue go to Etzel Ford. The rest of them go to Fordson. Eunice, the majority of it, again, the small percentage that goes to Dearborn High. And then Stout is the one that's split in 3 right now. Those Stout students, the 20 Stout students that go to Fordson, live within 2-3 blocks of the school, so it really didn't make much sense to move them anywhere else when the boundaries were done a few years back. Okay, so we looked at proposal 1, the first proposal that we had given, which was putting Bryant and Smith at Dearborn High, Salina, and half of Stout. Was that all of Stout? That's all of Stout. Salina and all of Stout, and then Woodworth. Part of Woodworth, that was the 200 students of Woodworth, that was going to be west of Greenfield. Those students are all west of Greenfield, and that would make Etzel Ford's population. Fordson's population was going to be all of Lori, all of Eunice, most of Woodworth, and then your STEM students for all 3 high schools. That was proposal 1 that we talked about prior to going out to the community forums. Those are the maps that are showing kind of the boundaries and how that would be cut up. And in this one here, I'm sorry, the only split school you would have here is Woodworth. And then some pros and cons to proposal 1. You have a more aligned feeder school model. and then you reduced number of students both at Dearborn and at Fortson. And some of the negatives, some of the cons were moving Smith students to DHS, and that wasn't very favorable to a lot of the Smith community, the Etzel Ford community. And so, you know, the concern became, is Etzel Ford going to lose part of its identity with the history of those Smith students attending Etzel Ford? Proposal 2, again, just to review it real quickly, you had Brian Stout and Eunice, so you're still removing the Smith kids from Dearborn High. Etzel Ford, you're going to have Salina and Smith, and most of Stout, again, the Snowwoods students would be there. And then Fortson was going to have Lori, the Stout 20 that live right there, again, next to Fortson. Eunice, the same Eunice population that goes to Fortson. And Woodworth, the majority of them. Again, your changes here was Woodworth moving and then Smith moving. Those are your 2 big changes in that one. Your split schools here were going to be Stout and Eunice. Transportation increase of a slight increase of 2 buses. And there you go for your pros and cons for proposal 2. Less of the feeder model supported in this one. The River Oaks students who traditionally have gone to Dearborn High would be going to Etzel Ford, so that was a change too. Not welcomed by some people in the River Oaks community. This one, why is it positive? It maintains Etzel Ford's identity, having the majority of Smith students or even all the Smith students going there. And again, you reduce your numbers at Dearborn High and Fortson. Proposal 3, again, had Smith, all of Smith going to Dearborn High to join Bryant. And Woodworth now was split into bigger chunks with the Henry Ford Miller students going to Etzel Ford and the William Ford and Miller students going to Fortson. Stout was going to be the same population and no change on Stout as far as Etzel Ford went. And then Stout was going to be moving back to Fortson where the Maple students used to go once upon a time before these first boundary decisions were made about 10 or 15 years ago. Eunice, again, all of Eunice was going to attend Fortson. Okay, so again, some changes here. And the transportation increase, again, nominal increase there as far as transportation goes at Dearborn High, but a significant increase at Etzel Ford as to the total of the number of total buses that would be going to Etzel Ford.
Mr. Masur?
Yes, sir.
Every one of these proposals, though, allows for the overcrowding to be solved.
For the most part, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're changing the population as far as where they're attending school, so yes.
Right.
Okay, so then we went to the community forums. Obviously, Mr. Jafer and David Mustonen did a phenomenal job at all those forums, and I know many of you attended as well, the trustees and so on. And we listened to the community very intently because those were just proposals, they weren't decisions. And I think it's important that people realize that. And for us, we listened to what people had to say. We, read the countless emails that we received, and we tried to come up with some proposals that would address some of the concerns that people in the community made. Yes, sir.
Just want to make a comment with that too. It's kind of like our hiring committees. When we go to the community, we ask people to come and sit, and we say we have input in the process, but one person doesn't necessarily get the full decision as to who the hire candidate would be for administration. It's the same thing. It was an opportunity for input, so although one person may be out there and say, well, I wanted exactly this. Well, they might not get exactly this, but we looked at the different ideas surrounding it to come up with final recommendation. That's similar to our HR hiring process, and that would be similar if we do have an infrastructure committee that comes together, is that there's input into it, but the final decisions go up on through administration to the board. So I just wanted to make it clear, so if someone was there and says, well, you didn't listen to me. Well, we did actually, but there may be different proposals that were developed based on those ideas. But again, there's not one perfect solution. There's ideas and input that was taken from the community. So I just wanted to be clear about that, just like we are when the community sits on the hiring committees.
Just to add on to that, Dr. Maleko, honestly, when I go and look back at our initial proposals and now just see everything after the input from the community forums as well, kind of gives me a sigh of relief. Because at one point, you start to see how constrained maybe we were with just those proposals. So to me in specific, it was very important because now I felt that I had more options, better ideas, and some aha moments as well. So that was very important.
Yeah, thank you. And again, we thank the community, those who are here today, everybody. We appreciate the input. We want to listen and take that in, so thank you.
Now, one of the comments, I guess negative comments after we came out with proposal 4, 5, and 6 was, well, some of them don't have a great deal of change from some of the earlier proposals, whether it be proposal 2 or proposal 3. And the answer to that is real simple. Some things are just make sense to keep where they are. For example, Salina being at Etzel Ford, Bryant being at Dearborn, Lori being at Fortson, those things make sense. So that we really didn't change a whole lot when it came from, proposals 1 through 3 to 4, 5, 6. Some of the things are still consistent across the board. And so, I'm sorry, I went through proposal 4. So anyhow, so proposal 4, we look at, again, Bryant and Eunice, and this is, again, what we did is we took some ideas from the different proposals, ideas from the community that represented those schools, and said, okay, what else can we look at? So proposal 4 had all of Bryant and Eunice, so very much feeder-oriented. Salina, Smith, it would be all of Smith, and half of Stout, again, very feeder-oriented, and Fortson as well, Lori, all of Woodworth, and half of Stout. Again, Stout, to not split Stout doesn't make any sense. You have to split Stout by at least 2 schools, if not all 3. And why is that? Why does it have to be that way? Because you have the Stout community right here that walks to Etzel Ford, and you have the other Stout community that's by Maple. So unless you're going to bring all of them here to Etzel Ford, which is, again, another thing to look at. But then if you do that, then you have to look at what you're going to do with Salina or Smith. So again, Stout, pretty much we have to split the population there. So if you look at those numbers, Dearborn High is still a little bit high at 2,000. Etzel Ford is higher at 1,880, which is a nice number for Etzel Ford. But still, Etzel Ford can house more students than that number there. Fortson is still on the high side, but again, it's a little bit lower than where it would be. So if we look at the boundaries, and as far as how things are going to be cut up on the maps, that's how it looks. The orange representing Dearborn High, yellow is always representing Fortson, and the black is always representing Etzel Ford. Busing, you'd have 14 buses at Dearborn High and 12 at Etzel Ford. You're net at 26, which would be very similar to where we are today. Not much change in that. Yes?
When you say that with the busing, if we're going to take all of Eunice in this one and take it to Dearborn High, it would only require 2 buses?
2 buses more, because you're leaving the Stout kids that were getting bused to Dearborn would not get bused to Fortson. Correct. You're trading as to who gets bused. Correct.
I just want to make sure.
No problem. Okay, and so proposal 5, we kind of split into 5A, 5B. Yes, I'm sorry.
Can I just mention something on that? We did make some tweaks on 5 since the last meeting, and I just kind of want to explain what happened. We have our high school principals here, and we had some meetings with them, and so we did tweak a few things, and we actually came up with a 5A and a 5B, which are the same kind of theory, but it was based on the meeting that we had with them to try to, and we've had them in other meetings, but it was after we took the revised proposals, they came up with some tweaking off of 5. And so I just wanted to make it known that when we presented this at the last board meeting, there was just 1 5. That has been changed into a 5A and a 5B with kind of a similar philosophy, and I don't know if any of the high school principals wanted to make any comment on that. Maybe we can let Mr. Mashur present it, and then you guys can feel free to add your take onto that proposal.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
Mr. Mashur is right that what came out was kind of logical, but I just think that we should put on the floor that some other proposals were brought forward, like to move Salina or to move, there were a couple other schools, I don't remember who was proposed to move, but we did look at those. It just,
Sure.
And Mr. Andrews jogs my memory of this, the busing situation turned out to be the factor there. So I think that we should say that we didn't just look at our own proposals. There were other ones that were considered. There were a lot of things that were considered. They just turn out to be
Sure.
Specific,
logistical
right,
factors or
specifically
whatever.
Salina moving to Fortson.
Yeah.
There's no, Fortson can't handle those that
Buses,
number of
right.
buses, that amount of buses. They can barely handle the special education buses that are there. So adding buses from having the Salina students going to Fortson as opposed to Etzel Ford, it's very, very difficult to make that work.
There's a second factor with
The
that
second
too.
factor is-
The community didn't
One
wants to
community saying,
maintain
hey,
Etzel, and they're happy with the
correct.
current going.
Move
and that
Salina
was
to
consistent.
Fortson, and the Salina community is saying, well, wait a minute, you moved us out of Fortson not a
30
few years
years
ago,
ago.
yeah, so some time ago, and to us now, Etzel Ford is our home school. We're all Etzel Ford, and so there's, again, there's some pride in that and so on, so.
Well, there's been infrastructure built up with Mr. Caseboat. We have regular community meetings. There's great communication. There's a lot of positive, and there's a great feel and connection. And again, we continue to improve, but I appreciate his work. And not only that, but we've had Mr. Loera and Ms. Sue Stanley and the feeders involved in these meetings. So the word I was getting from the group there is they want to continue with that momentum. Can we still make improvements? Yes, but they're very happy with the direction we've been going in. And that was clear both from not only the community forum, but that was clear from my side conversations with them and also from the meetings that we've had officially with Mr. Casebolt and the others.
Okay, so proposal 5A, you have Bryant and then Smith River Oaks, which is currently the current situation, and Stout, which is again the current Stout population at Bryant. I'm sorry, at Dearborn High. The one missing out of there would be Eunice, the current students that, the small, like 40 students that go from Eunice to Dearborn High, those students would be moving to Fortson. So that brings our number at Dearborn High down to an even more favorable number at 1,820. Okay, Etzel Ford, we increased the population at Etzel Ford by adding those students from Woodworth that are west of Greenfield. The same Smith population would be there, same Stout population. So the only thing you're doing to Etzel Ford is you're adding the 200 students from Woodworth. Fortson, the number goes up to 2860, which is obviously on the high side. And the only thing, Fortson's losing the 200 students from Woodworth, but they're gaining some of the 160 students from Eunice that were going to Dearborn High would now all go to Fortson. And the same Stout students that are there would continue to be there. Again, you see Stout split into all three, which is exactly how it is now. The only number that's really high, obviously in that scenario, is the Fortson number. The Dearborn number is a little bit lower than that, and I guess I can let Ms. Al-Qadri talk about some of the programs and so as to why she feels in her community, her school, her staff feel that they can handle some of those numbers. And again, remember too that it's not going to be 2,900 students next year. Yeah, it's not going to be all at once. We're going to phase those students in over the course of over the next 4 years. And as some of those programs that are allowing students to go to Michael Berry and pursue other interests and so on, to grow those programs. And so by growing those programs, you alleviate some of the numbers at Fortson. Ms. Al-Qadri, you want to?
We are planning on turning Fortson into
Microphone?
Oh, we need to put a microphone on.
We're working on changing Fortson into career academies where students have to select a career, and it involves a lot of stuff. But what it means is more things going on at the Michael Berry Center, additional things going on at the college. We want students to leave our school with a purpose, with a long-term plan, not just walking out with a high school diploma. So with the programs and how it works is there's going to be additional classes that they'll be able to take at the college once we meet with the college. And the other thing is I'm working with Dr. Masalman, Dr. Green, for as soon as next year to move some other couple of my classrooms to the Michael Berry in the business area, so that would decrease how many students are in my building. So I just feel that we need to give students more career opportunities, and a lot of those opportunities are going to land themselves at the Michael Berry Center and the college.
Trustee Ahmad, did you have something?
Yeah, I want to comment on that because that's one of the things that I look for.
Yeah.
When I'm looking at, does an idea make sense? I always think, what educational opportunities is it bringing to our children? And I do have to say one thing about Fortson and some of the rates that came in for college readiness. Fortson is doing great. And I think part of that is that many students, specifically at Fortson, and I think that we see more students from Fortson taking advantage of those opportunities, the opportunities that we have in the district. And that to me is very important because we're actually seeing results. Now, with that, what you're saying is, when we're talking about 2,860 students, not all those students would be in the building at the same time.
Correct. They would be at the college, Michael Berry Center, DCMST, co-op. We even have a teacher cadet program where I have students going to the elementary for an hour working with the elementary students. So we really are looking to have, I want kids to take away something. The diploma is wonderful, and that's what we want, but they also have to have some sort of passion for some career track and where they're going. It can't be just about the classroom, you know what I mean, adding those classrooms. We've got to add them where we need them in terms of the students, what we want students to do in the future.
Are you concerned about the increased number and all of the Eunice kids being moved to Fortson? Now, I know you love your Eunice kids.
I love my Eunice kids.
So I want to make sure you're not just saying that because you want to
No.
bring your Eunice kids
No,
in.
it just, you know, they're in the area. I just don't understand why we would have to have them bus to Dearborn High. I mean, I'm thinking about the busing. The kids knew each other. A lot of them know each other from elementary, middle school.
Trustee Thorpe?
The one thing you said is if they're going to be in programs over at the Berry Career Center or at the college, those are options for them.
Yes.
Do you think enough students would take
Yep.
that offering if it was there so that you wouldn't worry about the
Yeah,
overcrowding?
you know, the conversations with the students and the counselors is changing. Our first grade to go into this career academy concept is my current ninth graders. We've been working with them. They've been on career cruising, deciding on career path. So the conversations are going to be a lot longer, more detailed. It's not, here's 6 classes, this is your schedule. Here's your career plan, and this is how we're going to get you there.
Trustee Lang?
I was concerned also, when I was thinking about all of the movements, I was really concerned about the small pockets of students. Here you have 80 Stout students that are going back to Fordson. That's a concern for me when you have a pocket of 20 kids from Eunice that are going to Fordson, you know, which is 2,500 or 3,000 kids. I just imagine, you know, somebody coming out of middle school, opening the door, and there's 3,000 people.
But they live right in the neighborhood.
Well,
Mary.
and some of those, you know,
Right.
things, I get there's a whole bunch of issues in that, but emotional and social comfort aids academic achievement. So I was looking around, and I'd like to continue to know where are small pockets. I really don't want to leave, you know, 50 students here and 80 there and 20 there. So that was something that I was wondering about in that. I mean, we want, with all of our proposals, to try to clean up the boundaries more. And I think that has an important component in the academic achievement for students. So.
Trustee Nasser, did you?
I have at Dearborn, Etzel, and Fortson, how many students each hour are in either their homeschool, the Michael Berry Center, DCMST, or they're taking college courses. And the first 3 hours at Fortson, you have just over an average of 200 kids gone. And then in the afternoon, it increases. 4th hour, there's over 300 kids gone. 5th hour, over 400 kids gone. 6th hour, there's over 600 kids gone and out of Fortson. At Dearborn,
That's a significant.
yeah, and Fortson does have the largest number of students. The sixth hour, there's 500 students taking college classes.
Right.
At Dearborn High, it's the same thing. You have across the whole day, an average of about 200 students out of Dearborn High. And at Etzel, you have like 125 on average out of Etzel Ford. So it's, even though the number seems so high at Fortson, you have a huge number of students gone.
For a good reason.
For
Gone-
good
They're not
reason.
skipping class.
No.
Trustee Nasser share her little spreadsheets here. She's got a nice.
They're like little, wrote them up.
Nice layout.
Look how organized that is.
It's a higher number proportionately, but there's a higher population.
At Fort
So
Size.
it
Yeah.
makes sense that there would be a higher number who would leave.
And those are first semester numbers, and I will tell you, second semester numbers are even higher.
Trustee Barry?
Yes, Trustee Lane makes a very valuable point that I lived. One of my sons actually was bused to Smith for 2 years. And somebody decided, let's just move these kids around to Stout, so he served out his last year at Stout. And he was in that, what we call that little pocket of 20 or so students. So all his friends that he lost at Smith, that went down to Ford, then he was at Stout for a while, made some friends because he was an athlete and overall good student. Those students went to Dearborn High, and he ends up going to Fortson. So yeah, the social aspect, even though it's only 20 here or 60 here, whatever, that's very, very valuable. That's a very extra point. Sending some of the kids from Fortson to Michael Berry Career Center, those kids are going to be bused, I would imagine,
Yes,
and that's not going to create an issue.
They're already
They're already
they're
bused.
currently being bused.
But there's going to be more of them. There might be another bus or what have you.
Yeah, during the middle of the day, it's a lot
doesn't
easier
matter.
for the buses to work as opposed to, because they will still be Fortson students, kind of like the Collegiate Academy students or the DCMST students. They're still classified as Fortson students, even though half the day they're gone.
Okay. Just a couple comments, not questions here. These programs are going to be options. There's no guarantees.
Right.
Okay, A. B, the hallway. I don't care if 200-300 students leave first hour, another 200 leave. Even towards the end of the day, between fourth and fifth hour or after lunch, those hallways are just crazy. I've been there, where the kids are trying to move from one classroom to another. Okay, just a comment. And the other comment was, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, over 15 years ago, I don't say it's a problem. I look at this as an opportunity. We're a growing district.
Right.
So it's always been at Fortson. It's always been at Fortson. And some of these numbers I'm looking at so far that's still keeping Fortson at a very high number. You know, at first we saw reports back in May that we can probably get Fortson down to 2,200 students. Nowhere in any of these options that's on the table. At best, it's 2698, 2700. Now I'm looking at 2860. So we're trying to, all these years,
Next one.
for the last 2 decades, we've been trying to solve the pressure, it's probably the better word, at Fortson, and we're self-creating other issues. But let's not forget about those students. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, Mr. Mashur, Maple, Horger, those kids, you know, that go to Maples, but they come back. We really need to think how we're affecting those students. They deserve our acknowledgement too.
Absolutely.
Just a comment, thank you.
No problem. Just so you know, the Stout breakup here in 5A is exactly what we have today. So it's what's been for years. Now, that doesn't mean that just because that's how it was, we keep it the same. So I understand your point. But just so you know, so I want everyone to realize the change here is Eunice, the pocket of Eunice students who were at Dearborn High would now be all at Fortson. And so that's one change. The second change would be Woodworth. We would increase the number of students that go to Etzel Ford significantly in this proposal. So those are your two main changes.
I get that part, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of pieces in here that I'm starting to like, but I think when we start talking about long-term solutions, we have to include those students here and there. I mean, they're ours.
Absolutely. That's when we
own
get to
them.
proposal 7, I think it is, so.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, so busing would increase at Etzel Ford here by 3 buses, a total of 3 buses throughout the district. So currently we're at 14 at Dearborn High, 10 at Etzel Ford. It would go up to 14 and 13 under this proposal. Okay, so a total of 27 buses. Construction at Dearborn High, Etzel, and the Berry Center.